The time, 18 minutes to 8. Let's get a further taste of the EU debate from north of the border this morning. Jim is joining us again from Glasgow. Morning again, Jim.
Indeed, I'm in Glasgow, Justin. Thanks very much. Where the older generation look at the River Clyde and realise that it isn't really the river they once knew. From the city centre here, if you look along the water, you would once have seen cranes and gantries filling the sky all the way westwards to the sea. Now, these shipyards from the late 19th century onwards were the engine of empire. They built navies and liners, and this was one great river factory. No more. The work has dwindled. A new industrial revolution has taken most of it away, and a whole iron landscape has gone. I'll be talking to some of the men who still build ships here in a moment about where this story sits in the arguments over Europe. But first, to the Glasgow University Archive. I'm Tony Pollard, archaeologist and historian at the university, to savour some of the history that made the Clyde. We look together at the beautiful plans for the doomed liner Lusitania.
She was almost 800 feet long in reality, and what you've got here is a cutaway which shows all of the interior. So you've got the lovely salons, the luxurious passenger cabins, the engine rooms. It was liners like the Lusitania that had really made the reputation of Clyde shipbuilding.
Looking back from today, it's interesting to realise that it was always a precarious business, even in the days of its great success, because there was competition everywhere.
Very much so, and the fact that these companies had to change their products and their technologies took massive investment, and at times that would be misjudged or it would be too late. So this is nothing new.
When the Clyde was at its height, from the centre of Glasgow, as far as the eye could see down the river, it must have been just a hive of activity.
It was, and both sides were just chock-a-block with not just shipbuilding, but all of the ancillary industries designed to support it.
And here, beside the Lusitania, is a book called Scotland's Industrial Souvenir, filled with wonderful photographs and accounts of what's been going on here, and a beautifully engraved page here, coloured page, advertising various firms who are doing great things, and prominent among them, the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company Limited, over at Govan, across the river from the archive here, and I'm going over there now.
A few hours earlier at Fairfield Shipyard, Govan, the Queen launched the Canadian Pacific liner Empress of Britain. Here is the beauty that can come only from fine craftsmanship, handed down from father to son through the good years and the grim.
The glory days. It's so different now. At Fairfields, where so many great hulks were built, BAE Systems are building a few offshore patrol vessels. There are 800 men divided between here and Rosyth and Fife who are clinging on to jobs. When I sat down with some of the yard workers, I was reminded, however, that this isn't new.
It's often been very difficult. You could never plan for a future because you never knew if you had a future.
That came about, Ian, because of cheap work elsewhere in the world. I mean, it was like Korea in the 50s and then China.
Yeah, you're right there. I remember being in Govan in the mid-70s, and they started selling the designs to the Japanese, to the Chinese, and to other countries.
You see, we don't have an industrial strategy in this country. We have a finance industry. You cannot compete with a country like China on the basis of selling each other insurance policies.
The question is, do you need a national industrial strategy? The director of the Lancashire Institute for Economic and Business Research, Phil Wyman, thinks a break with the European Union would help.
The EU doesn't want one section of its single market to be treated more favourably than others. So we can't help our firms. Brexit allows the possibility of doing things a different way. It allows the possibility of having a more active industrial policy.
But to David Bailey, Professor of Industrial Strategy at Aston Business School at Birmingham University, that's plain wrong.
There are good reasons for having rules on state aid so that we get fair competition across the single market, but this argument that prevents us from having an effective industrial policy is complete hogwash. I mean, look, for example, what's happened in the steel industry recently. It was the British government which opposed higher tariffs at a European level against Chinese imports. And if you look at other countries in Europe, being part of the EU has not stopped them intervening to support their steel.
Back to the Clyde, and John Brown and Ian Turnbull, workers here for more than 30 years. One thinks Europe helps, the other doesn't.
If we come out of Europe, then are we going to get work from elsewhere?
Do you think there's a chance?
I don't think there's a chance. I think it'll be stopped, but we won't get any other contracts.
You were shaking your head there.
In the 80s and 90s and at the early 2000s, we were going to Germany and Holland to work. It's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You go to Italy, Germany and Spain and you see their big shipyards. When a government is determined to save its industry, then forces, money, finance and technology can be brought to save that industry.
And do you think that is irrelevant to us being in the EU?
What we need is an industrial policy.
But there's an extra ingredient here. John Brown can see the argument for a one-nation industrial strategy, but he's never going to be a cultural Brexiteer.
We like being Europeans. We like being able to go to Spain, go to Seville, go to Rome. We like all that. My granddad's name was Daniel McConville. He was an immigrant. I'm married to a Bengali Scottish girl. My son's gone with a Kurdish refugee lassie. So I don't interested in unions, that's fine in polls. It's the future for your kids and yourself. And I think a bigger entity like Europe provides us with a safer future than a tiny wee island.
So, on the Clyde, where the great industries have winnowed away in the last generation, there's a feeling that wherever you stand on the question being put next month, that perhaps is not the most important question. It's what government, any government, can do to help these industries match the challenges of the time. And maybe that's a question that's even more complicated than remain or leave.
More from Jim in